Hello, this is another workshop in the November series of Clojure. Today we will be focusing on Notespace, which is one of those tools for literate programming in Clojure. Tomorrow there will be another workshop about pause, which is another tool of this kind, probably more interesting. So I encourage you to go tomorrow. And I'll share my screen and we'll do like a little demo and get a feeling of it and mostly discuss it. And as I mentioned before the recording, if anybody wishes to try it and anything doesn't work for you, then I encourage you to just reach out to me and let us talk and see how we can make things work. It helps a lot in developing the tool. I'll share the screen now. So you see, I have my editor here, and also the browser, and we will mostly play in the editor and the browser. And you have the Zulip chat for today, so you see we would use it for chatting, and that's a good practice because then we can kind of make these beginnings of discussions that can continue further later. And what we also have here is some browser view of today's presentation. And this browser view is created by this tool called Nodespace that we will be discussing. And the idea is that we have this code on the right and browser on the left, and the code is generating the browser view in some way. And I think just to get an idea of what this tool does, we'll just play with it just a little, and then we'll discuss the scope of what we wish to do. So I'll jump to the demo, which is also something that exists here in the code. And you see, this is just a Clojure namespace with regular Clojure code. And we can edit code and make some changes to it, like change this number. And when I save the file, for example, the browser view updates. And when I evaluate some code, then the browser view updates with the result. So in this way, we are getting this notebook, so to speak, that contains text we may write as comments and just our regular Clojure code, and also the outputs that could be things of this kind, like numbers or data structures, but they could be also visual outputs, as we will see in a moment. And you see it can be a random number, for example. And maybe just so that we get like a sense of something visual, let us see like a certain data visualization we have here. And we can evaluate this and get the data visualization. So that is a little taste of this tool. And I just wanted to give an idea of what we're talking about. And then what we will do is try to discuss the landscape that this tool belongs to and our needs and hopes about this field. And then I hope maybe come up with some thoughts for the near future. Does anybody have any thought about this, or question or comments? Great. So so let us look at the code setup. You see, we are requiring the tool's main API namespace that we'll use just a little bit just to restart the tool, for example, so that it works for us. And also later we'll discuss these other namespaces, which are about specifying different kinds of visualizations. We don't need to bother about them at the moment. And then all we need in order to use the tool is to have a project that has the certain setup so that it can listen to user events in the REPL. And that is documented in Notespace. I'll not repeat it now, how to set up a project. And then, you know, from the REPL, you just need to call this restart function, and then it restarts your system, and then you have the browser view, and you can do things and see results and whatever you wish. So that is basically the user experience here. And now let us discuss what it is about. These names of data visualization and literate programming that are kind of related to this field, what they are. Is anybody familiar with this idea of literate programming? I guess data visualization is kind of clear, right? It is just creating some plot or any visual view that is created as a function of our data. But what is literate programming? Yeah, so as one of the friends said in a previous workshop, literate programming is the idea of looking into our code as a story, as something that can be told or written, right? So those notebook-like tools are all trying to create some experiences where you can write code, but also see your code as a certain document that you can read. So for example, here the setup not only appears in our Clojure namespace in the editor, but also here in our document. And this term that was termed by Donald Knuth, and it has been has got different implementations and different cultures of using it, and it has been rather important in the field of data science, where it is important to be able to document research and data exploration flows in a way that is clear and readable and also reproducible. And so this idea of literate programming is often very much connected to this idea of reproducible research, as it is called, which is the idea of being able to create a research that has where the fruits of the research are very much reproducible. They can be generated again with some changes, if you wish, but also very much as you did them in the past. So that is the scope, and there are quite a few Clojure tools that achieve these ideas, and somehow these needs are coupled for various reasons. Very often the tools you may use for visualizing data will be also the tools that allow you to create these kind of visual documents. And in this case, that is how our document looks like, this browser view that we have on the left. Any comments about this? Any thoughts so far?
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, nice. So I just posted. Hey, my name is Volodymyr, and I have a question. What's a big difference of using Nodespace over normal org mode in Emacs? Where you can
Fantastic.
use. Sorry?
Yeah. Thank you for bringing this question up. That's a great question, and I hope we discuss it in a moment. So basically, maybe actually, would you like to comment about what org mode is?
Yeah, org mode is they call it like it's a general purpose all as text system where I put everything as a plain text. And in relation to literature programming, I can put some parts of my source code and then evaluate it and get results inside the text. It's not that easy to get pictures inside the code. If I, for instance, made a plot of something, I will have it as separate files usually, but I think it can be done. And you don't need to run any servers or anything. You just need pure Emacs and install org mode. It usually goes with Emacs installed, and so you can just work.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic. Yeah, so thank you for mentioning this. And yeah, here we see, for example, a very basic org file in Emacs. And org mode, yeah, is this tool that is not just about Clojure. It has been used for literate programming in many languages. And it is something that allows you to write plain text, but with some structures in your plain text. For example, this outline hierarchy that we have here, right? And other many other features like being able to kind of play with the hierarchy and mark to do items, on all kinds of fun things one may do with plain text. And one of those things is being able to have code in the org file. I don't have this setup running now, so I cannot demonstrate it. Maybe Blaine or any other could demonstrate it. It could be actually interesting. But that is, I think, one of those differences that we care about, that some people may like to use plain text as the main kind of file they are writing when they wish to write documents. And some people may prefer the experience of being inside a Clojure code file, a Clojure namespace. And it is not obvious which mode of interaction and which file type is preferable. Really a matter of taste and really a very different experience. Whether one may wish to have text inside the code as we have here, which is kind of awkward maybe because of the comment marks and all that, or code inside text, which is quite wonderful in org mode, but with a few problems sometimes, I think, and also very much typically specific to the kind of editor you're using. So for example, org mode is an Emacs package, but it's not usable from other editors typically. Oh, maybe that is not completely true anymore because other editors did start supporting org mode, but not in a full way as Emacs does. So yeah, does it make sense? This main difference of where you would.
Totally makes sense. Very good point about we either have the code in the text or we have text in the code, and that totally makes sense. Where you want to focus more, I guess. It depends.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so thank you for this. And yeah, so org mode is one of those other options that I guess could be wonderful for some people. I hope we would look into some examples of uses of Nodespace in the past. Nodespace has been used for about 2 years, mostly in small study groups and individual projects in the Scicloj community, a little bit inside some companies, I think, but mostly as a community tool. And it has been evolving with different versions that actually did change the idea of how we liked to do these things. And so I just collected a few examples to have an idea of how we have been using it, just to inspire possible uses in the future. So one use is documentation. And the most famous example is this amazing Scicloj library, which is this machine learning library. We had a workshop about it yesterday with the author, Carsten Bering. And Scicloj is very thoroughly documented. And the documentation has been created as Clojure code files. So for example, you can see this file rendered here as a notebook. Take some time to load. And this file will be a collection of machine learning models that have been documented in a visual way. Oh, yeah, it did load. And you see, this is a previous version of Nodespace, Nodespace version 3. And you see it can contain visual outputs and tables, and it allowed Carsten to create this very systematic documentation of many types of machine learning models. So that is one use of Nodespace, documentation. Another one is kind of related, and that is what we sometimes call testable documentation or literate testing. And that was done, for example, in Clojure, this library for interop with R, with the R language. And let us maybe look into this example. So we have a rather technical topic of code generation between two languages. And this topic did require testing, unit tests, you know. So this document is actually a collection of unit tests, right? So you see the tests are passing here. And we have a summary saying that they are all passing, where at the time this document was rendered. And that is kind of important, you know, on one hand, using the tests as a way of learning about the library. And on the other hand, making sure our documentation is always correct just by making it testable, right? So yeah, and you know, making the tests very much readable and explainable. So that is another use of a notebook-like system, such as Notespace. And another use is visual documents, data visualizations. And here, for example, this example by our friend Tomasz Zulip, there are quite a few examples here. Maybe we'll look into this one, which is kind of fun. So you can see visual outputs and learn about data visualizations in a systematic way. So that is that. Oh, so I lost my page. Another thing is reproducible research that we mentioned. And I think one of the nice examples has been in this SICM Utils study group, which is learning about physics and symbolic math and calculus in Clojure. And this study group has been running for almost a year, I think. And let us maybe look into this example, for example, where we were practicing some textbook example of this famous Sussman and Wisdom SICM book, Structure and Interpretation of Classical Mechanics. And we wanted to see this visually, and it was quite fun to take the example that was created by the SICM, which is authors Sam Ritchie and Colin Smith, and turn it into a notebook where we can play, and also play in a interactive way with the visual outputs. And I think the physics group, this SICM Utils study group, has been one of those places that were driving us to discover more needs from our ecosystem, and it is still very much inspiring us to ask all the time how our experience could be better. Another thing which is kind of related is our study groups. So we mentioned those. Maybe the main one to be mentioned is this ML study group, which is, you know, just a Zulip stream where we meet in the weekends and have some sessions. And the sessions of the study group has been using data visualization and literate programming. So, for example, here is a session where we were exploring image processing using tensors, and we were playing with images. And then, you know, just at the end of the session, we can save our notebook in a visual way so that we can share it with future sessions. And oh yeah, and we also had some video sessions where we can look into that, but maybe not now. So that was a little taste of uses in the past where the Scicloj community has been using data visualization and literate programming tools, and Nodespace has been part of that and grew out of these needs we were encountering. Does anybody have any thought or question so far? Great. Oh, I'll just check the chat to see if there are any comments. Oh, I'm looking at Volodimir's comment. oh, so that is what you mentioned already with your voice about org mode. And then you wrote, I just thought that it should be much easier and conform to rebuild all results using Clojure project without having to run Emacs headlessly from the build script. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah, so it is a good time for comments if anybody wishes to say or ask anything. Otherwise, we will continue. Yeah, so maybe just for a moment, let us look into the broader landscape of different tools which are around these topics of literate programming and data visualization in Clojure. And you see that is a partial list of the many different ways to do that. And we will not talk about all of them, but it is interesting that some of these are very different in their flavor, in their assumptions about the preferred user experience. So some use the browser, for example, as the main place for interaction, and others work in plain text, but actually in editing plain text, as you mentioned, org babel, which is this way of having code inside org mode. Or another one, which is very interesting, is having Clojure code inside Markdown using this stack that the R ecosystem is using. So you may use the browser, you may use a plain text editor, or you could have many experiences in the browser, and maybe Site is the most interesting one because it is inventing a very unique user experience in the browser that is very, very much unlike the usual things that are called notebooks, because it goes in all kinds of directions and allows more flexibility in the structure of the visual document you're creating. And then there are other flavors of tools. So for example, there are Reveal and Portal, maybe a few were in the Portal meetup last week. So these tools just allow you to have some visual view alongside your editor, where you may just throw values to the visual tool from the editor or your REPL, and then explore them and dive into them. And so that is another flavor that is really interesting at the moment. There is another project called Pingorilla, which is a huge ecosystem of many libraries and tools that are kind of growing in harmony with each other. It is still under heavy development, and two of the interesting tools are called Goldly and Reval, which is reproducible eval, and they are creating. We cannot describe now the scope of all the things which are under experiments there, but it is so thoughtful and interesting. So I encourage you to look there. And then another flavor is just having data visualizations inside the editor, just like I'm writing here some code and text here, I could have a visual plot here. I cannot do that at the moment, but there are tools to do that. And the REPL tooling project, that is the infrastructure of Clojure IDEs like Chlorine and Clojure, allows that, to have plots and other visual things inside your code editor. And now we're coming to this last point here, which is those tools which are encouraging to use your namespace as a notebook. And that is what we are trying here too. Notespace is one of these, where your Clojure namespace, the usual place where one may just create Clojure code and interact with it, is a place of creation of a notebook. And the notebook is just a view of your interaction that takes place in your namespace. And I think these are, at least to me, these are the most known cases. Marginalia, which is quite a few years ago, have been a nice way to create Clojure documentation from Clojure files. Oz, which is also quite established for a few years, and maybe the most established of those tools we're discussing now. And we'll have a an Oz workshop tomorrow, and Notespace that we are looking into now, Clerk that is just emerging, and we'll have a talk about it in the conference, and Goldly that we mentioned, and it really is beyond the scope of this discussion because it is so much. So that is the scope where we will be discussing, and maybe in a moment we will focus into the differences between these few tools. Any comments so far? I know it is quite a trouble to look into many tools without actually being able to see them and try to imagine, but I think that is quite part of our situation where there is a lot going on and we need to make sense of it. Any thoughts or comments? Any comments? Great. So now maybe let us focus on those four, which are, at least for me, my main interest nowadays is in these four tools, which are kind of related to this idea of using your namespace as a notebook. And I will not kind of dive in too much into them, but I'll just say that all of them are also interesting as platforms for creating visual experiences, because there are, I mean, at least the other ones, they have really nice front-end infrastructure that can be used for more explorations. And I've been learning, you know, as a person who doesn't know so much about front-end development, and you know, the Nodespace front-end is rather basic. I've been learning about those other tools, and it is very promising to see just the architecture of how they were built and what they allow to create in the future. And so Nodespace, that where we're looking into today, will probably use front ends of other tools in the future because they offer so much magnificent ideas there. And also in the past, actually, currently, it has been built using parts of the Pink Gorilla ecosystem we were mentioning. Let us mention Oz, that will be presented tomorrow by Christopher Small. Oz is a lot. It allows for very, very different modes of interactions, and it allows for creation of documents and web apps and websites, and it allows for a certain live reload experience where you can just save your code file and have your view updated. And actually, it supports both modes, writing code in plain text and plain text in code. And both, as much as I know, offer this live reload experience where you just save and get an up-to-date result of your document. And it is trying to be clever by just evaluating everything that is below the point of change in your file. I see a comment by Blaine. Perfect. Yeah, let us discuss namespaces in a moment. Yeah, thank you. And basically, what are namespaces? Namespaces are usually just Clojure files. Usually, there is a one-to-one correspondence between your Clojure file you're editing and a Clojure namespace. And the idea of the Clojure experience allows you to access things which are defined in another namespace, but not just by using their name, but by using the namespace as a prefix. So, for example, I may wish to use the Notespace restart function. So there is a certain namespace that I'm requiring here in my demo namespace, and that is this Notespace API. So you see, I can ask for functions from that namespace, like the restart, and then I can use this name here in my namespace using the prefix from the other namespace. And also we have this alias here that can be used for shorter notation of that. So I could write just, you know, Nodespace restart. So for those of you who know Python, for example, it is a little bit similar to Python modules, but I think that the development experience is more dynamic and allows you to be very playful with developing your namespaces and growing them, and also to be rather safe about the process, the flow of updating your namespaces with new kinds of functionality or changing existing functionality. So as much as I know, Clojure namespaces are similar to Python modules on the surface, but in the experience they create, I think they are more playful and dynamic, and in a sense allow, in my opinion, more harmony with the structure of your code. But maybe somebody here may wish to comment about it more. I'm happy that you raised this topic, Blaine, because it is kind of central to what we're doing, and maybe I'll be happy if anybody wishes to say anything more about namespaces. Is it okay? Oh, see a comment. Oh, great! Thank you so much. Great. So Oz allows you, as we said, to edit either code in text or text in code and have this live reload experience of an updating visual document with data visualizations and such. Notespace is similar, but it doesn't, at least in the current version, doesn't rely on file save in the kind of event that is driving evaluation. Oz, as much as I know, and tomorrow we'll have a workshop about it, Oz is driven in this live reload experience. It is driven by file changes, and file changes cause code evaluations, and that causes the document to update. Notespace tries to do less and just listen to whatever the user is doing with the code, and we'll see what it means in a moment. Clerk is a very new tool that goes after this Oz idea of live reload, as much as I know, and brings more ideas about hashing and caching and code analysis that allow it to be very clever about updating the document, and it needs typically to evaluate less expressions when there is a change in the file. And that matters a lot, of course. It also allows a very nice system of an extensible system of visualizing data in many data structures, and there is a lot of it seems a lot of happiness in the community about this tool nowadays, and it is very much active. Goldly is beyond the scope of this discussion. I hope we'll look into it soon. As we said, it is part of a whole ecosystem called Pingorilla, which is very much extensible to and also built upon a very interesting experience of creating Clojure-based tools and visual apps. But it will also allow for this kind of experience of staying in the code and having an updated view, probably a little more similar to the Nodespace way, but of course much more than that. Okay, so these are maybe the 4 tools personally I'm currently interested in, and my hope for the coming weeks is to try more of how to integrate Nodespace with the front-end side of some of those other tools, and the proof of concept in the last few days has been promising for that. Any comments about these tools or any other general thoughts or comments or questions? Yeah, so so let us continue. Just wanted to kind of briefly mention that these two ideas have been driving, I think, the way Nodespace has been growing. Really, a large number of people have been contributing to it in many ways, and to the ideas behind it, to testing it in different situations, to actually specifying what we may want. And the idea is to grow our tools with the community needs, usually in our study groups that we are meeting every week. And it was kind of coupled together with this study experience we were having. And the other central idea here, I think, is to flow with the REPL, which means to try not to introduce too many changes to the usual REPL and editor experience in Clojure, and just listen to it and reflect what the tool knows when it listens. And that is a bit different from the more brave idea, one may say, we were mentioning earlier. Oh, sorry for this. Just lost my page. So, you know, when we discussed Oz, for example, Oz is listening to file changes, but it is also invoking evaluations of code so that the document can update after file change. And Nodespace tries to avoid that as much as possible and just listen. And the reason is partially that I think the Clojure experience of just being in the editor and evaluating code and writing things in the REPL is so playful and wonderful, and it is part of the power of Clojure. And it might be a pity to lose that, and it is difficult to create other experiences which are as playful and dynamic as that. And at least my experiments of creating other experiences proved to be difficult. And we're talking about creating experiences with multiple threads, right? There is a thread listening for file changes, and there is the thread of your REPL, and things are happening concurrently. And we are talking about invoking computations. So a lot is going on, and it is just difficult to have the user feel comfortable in this situation where not everything is visible typically, not everything is known. And I'm so hopeful about those experiences of Oz and Clerk, and they are very much beloved and useful in some situations. But here we are looking to create something more dynamic in a sense, or at least more similar to the usual Clojure experience, the way I understand it. And yeah, how do we interact with Nodespace? So we have like 4 kinds of interaction. One is file change. Let us see it in action. So, right, we can change the file. Here I'm changing the file and saving, and the view updates. So that is one thing. Another is loading the Clojure namespace. You know, when you change your code, you can load it. So, you know, I can add some code here, for example, and I can load the file, and this also updates the code. But you see, loading the file does not add the outputs of evaluation here. The reason is mostly that the way Clojure works, loading a whole namespace, which is kind of similar to loading a whole Python module, if you wish, it does not generate intermediate results of all the forms throughout the namespace. So the value of this addition is not known to us after we loaded the file. So it turns out. And that is at least how most Clojure tools work. They just load a whole file and not gain up more information about intermediate results. Now, another thing is evaluating a region, part of the file, or maybe even just a single expression, right? So here, for example, I evaluate this, and then I do get the result. So that allows us to be more refined in what we are asking, and also to get outputs, visual outputs and such. Yeah, and the other component here is tabs. So you see there are tabs. Basically, they belong to subsections of our text. So, for example, I could decide that this belongs to a different tab, and I use this markdown section notation. And when I save the file, you see, oh, it didn't work because it is kind of considered one comment. So I put some mark between them to distinguish. And then, you know, that code, that text is not in this tab anymore. It is in a new tab. And that is kind of useful when one wants to do like slides for presentations, or just to organize the code as we are doing now. So that's the model of interaction, nothing more than that. We'll just see just a little more later, but basically that's it. And you see, most of what I mentioned was just about changing the code, evaluating the code, saving the file, not about browser interaction, not about invoking new kinds of evaluation semantics, just doing the usual things I like to do. Does it make sense? Any thoughts or comments? Great. So we were already here in this tab of the demo, and we saw it evaluating, right? And so I hope we got a feeling of it. Now let us discuss how we can create visual things. So in Clojure, there is this notation that is called hiccup. Hiccup is a way to create, basically to create HTML in Clojure. So, you know, you have this HTML div for a rectangle, and then H1 for a header, right? And paragraph, and you can create all that. And we somehow need to tell Nodespace that it is creating HTML. So we see it doesn't know that if we don't tell anything. So one way to do it is this kind notation that we'll discuss in a moment. So when we told it is of hiccup kind, then when we evaluate it, we are creating this HTML output. Does it make sense? This idea of hiccup of HTML as a Clojure data structure, and this idea of generating it visually.
May I ask on which level this hiccup is working? It doesn't look like a normal Clojure construction. Is it something in Notespace or?
Could you explain? Oh, which version of hiccup? Yeah.
No.
Oh.
This hiccup, is it just a normal Clojure call, or it's something that embedded into Notespace, or how it works?
Yeah. It is just Clojure code. This kind notation, this prefix that we added here, let us ignore it just for a few minutes, but it is also just regular Clojure code.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. And then except for the fact that it is just usual Clojure code, it is actually not the usual hiccup, but a certain extended version of hiccup that contains more elements than the usual HTML elements. And it is based on a project called Gorilla UI that is part of this huge Pink Gorilla ecosystem. So maybe let's call it Pink Gorilla UI. And for example, here we have an element called pvega, which is just a data visualization of the Vega data format. And so this specification is of the Vega format, and I'll just organize it so that it fits here. And you see it is it can be included in our hiccup-like structure. So let us call it hiccup-like and not hiccup because it is extending hiccup. And you see when we evaluate that, then we get this Vega plot that is created here. And this idea of extending hiccup, you can see it with quite a few of the other tools we were mentioning, including Oz and Clerk, and certainly Goldly and quite a few others. And yeah, so, and you know, these things nest, they nest typically. So we can here have a div, which is an HTML rectangle, and have a paragraph saying hi. So when we evaluate this, then we get hi, right? And that means, you know, it is quite powerful. We can create HTML as a data structure as we usually like to do in Clojure. So we can create now hundreds of these in a Clojure map, for example, or whatever. Now, what about this kind hiccup notation we were using, right? What is that? Or maybe does anybody have a comment about this, about anything we have been seeing? Yeah, it is kind of nice to have things which are dynamic and random and have them change, right? So it's nice to have dynamic experiences in your code. Great. So now there is this need to tell our tool, Nodespace in this case, to tell it that a certain thing needs to be visualized in a certain way. And in Nodespace, we have been using some ways, and let us see them. So one of them is this kind notation. In Clojure, there is something called metadata. It is something that can be attached to a value. And this notation of this caret notation allows to attach metadata to a value. So we do not make it, in some sense, it is the same value, the same structure here. It will typically print the same. And if we compare it to another structure without the metadata, Clojure will say they are equal. But it just added this additional metadata. And here you see we are adding metadata on the code level. We just have a piece of code. This piece of code hasn't been evaluated yet. And we are adding these metadata here. And that can tell Nodespace, please consider this as something which is of kind hiccup. And in this kind namespace, there are many, not so many, or yeah, there are quite a few ways to specify the kind of thing to render in a certain way. Right, so that is that, and let us keep it hiccup. Right, so that works. Here we are using this Sparkline library, which is another thing that has a special tag in Gorilla UI that we have been using. And yeah, and we can generate a random walk, and it is nice to see quite a few of them, right? Yeah, maybe just for fun, since we are already here, let us maybe create quite a few of these. And so let us maybe take a range of numbers. Oh, I should have written it differently, like that. Does it work? Let us see if it works. Oh, yeah, these are the numbers we wanted. And so we have it now in the notebook. And now let us map for each of these numbers and create this kind of structure. And let us put all of these in one div structure. So you see, we got this big div that contains many things. And now we can say, let us render it with the hiccup kind. And we get many of these plots, many random walks. And oh yeah, but I forgot the most important thing. I wanted it to depend on I. So now we can have many of these. Each time the random walk is longer. Does it make sense? It's just like a little experiment with hiccup interaction. Any thoughts about this? Any comments? Great. So what we were doing here was adding some metadata to a code. And these metadata are not special notation. They are just some Clojure thing that is maybe not so commonly used, but you can do it. And here you see, you can add metadata from a certain namespace, and this namespace is having many values we can use. Great. So that is one thing. Another idea, oh, I see a comment possibly. Oh, thank you. Another idea is specifying the kind of a thing for the value we're creating, not for the code. So, you know, sometimes when you're writing the code, you don't know yet about the kind of visualization you will want to create. You may wish to decide on runtime. And we have this kindly is just a small library that is kind of separate from Nodespace, so that, you know, hopefully we can use these ideas in other tools, and kindly allows us to consider this value, to consider it as something of the kind Vega. And this is happening in runtime, not before evaluation, but during evaluation. So in potential, it allows for more flexibility. We could do this in an if clause or something and decide about it in runtime. And this works too. So, oh, I need to go to this new tab, value kind. Yeah, so we got here this Vega plot. So just a different flavor. Yeah, somebody is saying something maybe. Any comments? Oh, okay. Oh, maybe. Do you mean where it is implemented? Or yeah, so it is still work in progress, and it is the small library called Kindly. You see, it is not so documented, and actually the documentation is in Notespace, because Notespace is the only one using it. So I hope to write some notes about it. Thank you. Yeah, and more documentation must be coming soon. But another thing to comment about this is that, you know, and I hope we'll discuss it in a moment, these things, they are not compatible with the way other tools work. So that is a serious problem, because we want to create portable documents, portable namespaces that can be used with all tools. And I hope that we'll have some community discussion where possibly we may come up with maybe other ideas that will be used across different tools. And that hasn't completely happened yet. So, you know, this is just the way Nodespace is doing it at the moment. And it is in alpha stage, so it may change in the near future. Another idea here is kindness. Kindness is a Clojure protocol for those of you who know this, what is a Clojure protocol? It is a certain abstract functionality that Clojure types can implement, not so different from a Java interface, for example, but again, more playful, more flexible, typically, since we are in Clojure, and more extensible. And we have a certain Clojure protocol that is called kindness, and here we are defining a new Clojure type called big text, and here we are defining that this new type will implement the kindness protocol, and that means it needs to specify how it behaves on rendering. And you see, it just says, yeah, I will create this Scicloj struct-like structure that is big text. And so, when we create a value of this kind, like calling the constructor of it, so to speak, then it will render as big text. And that is how, for example, we can take data sets of the tablecloth library and ask them to render nicely as visually as tables, or we can take a buffered image object, which is this object of this Java class, to represent an image and be able to have this image render nicely as an image. That is what we did in that image processing notebook we saw earlier. So, interesting. I'll try to solve it later. Thank you for mentioning this. I did have a certain problem pushing things to closures earlier today, and I'll try to fix it later. So possibly this tutorial will not work before I fix it later today. Thanks. Yeah, it helps to know. Yeah, and maybe in any case, maybe let us. Oh, sorry. Let us just paste the link of this tutorial in the chat so that you can have it later. Oh. Sorry, I had the trouble pushing to the Clojure repo. Okay, so thank you. So that is kindness. So we were looking into different kinds of things. And now maybe another thing about this dynamic experience of a delay. So in Clojure, there is something called a delay. It is one of those time-related semantics in Clojure where you can define how things behave throughout time. So there are a few constructs which are quite interesting, like atom and agent and future, and delay is one of them, quite a simple one, where you can define, let us do it, let us define x to be a delay of some computation. It prints something and returns 9, and let us see at our REPL if it actually prints. So here I evaluate x, I defined it, and we didn't see anything printed because it is delayed. Now when I ask for dereferencing x using this @ sign, then it fails. Oh, that is interesting. Oh, no idea what happened. So interesting. Yeah, so I apologize for this error, null pointer exception printed. I have no idea why it happens, probably a bug in Notespace, because I see Notespace appearing here, so let us ignore it now. But you see, the idea of a delay is that you have something delayed. So that is quite important, you know, because when you have a Clojure namespace, you typically may wish to do some refactoring, to change some of your functions, to add some code, to remove some code, and then evaluate the whole namespace quickly so that you know everything is correct. And typically for dynamic, playful experience, it is important to be able to evaluate the whole namespace quickly. And if you have some slow computations there, like, for example, some data processing so that you can explore the data or visualize something on, or ask a query about the data, then those things can be kept in delays so that they would actually not happen if you just evaluate your whole namespace. They will happen if you ask about them concretely, if you ask about them like, please compute, like I did here. So in Nodespace, the idea is that if we have some of these, then Nodespace will ask them to compute. So you see now when I load the whole file, it didn't dereference the delay because it just loaded the whole file. But when I evaluate this piece of code, then Nodespace decides to ask about the value so that it can show it, right? So, so we have this ability to add some optional explorations to our code, which are, you know, typically possibly slow, right? And here it is a little bit slow. Let us make it slower, right? So we can wait and yeah, and now, you know, we're creating a troubling situation. We are kind of changing a little bit of our promise earlier to just flow with the usual user flow, because we are creating a new semantic where our tool is being active in asking for something. And that is risky. That creates concurrency problems and threading, threads running in the background doing things. And it proves to be troublesome. So we need to be careful when we're adding this kind of functionality to our tools. To me, this idea has been proven useful, but in general, we should be careful, I think. And in my opinion, seek experience that is that does not change too much the usual Clojure experience, unless we have any brilliant idea that may actually work brilliantly, which I don't. Yeah, another thing to know about this system does have bugs, and since we are doing some delicate things like listening to user events through this protocol called REPL that some of you may know, and since we are listening to file changes and we want to create a system that works with different Clojure editors and different versions of REPL, I've been running into bugs, and there are some concurrency bugs here. It is still buggy. And so it is useful to know that you can restart the whole system if you wish. And that means, you know, you need to refresh the browser too. And you can also do a more graceful restart just of the event system without restarting the web server, sorry. And that is sometimes useful so that you can kind of have it refreshed if it ran into some strange situation. Yeah, in a moment, let us discuss some of our future challenges. Maybe just another comment. There is this special tab here that is called Last Eval. And it is quite nice, I think, that we can just focus on what value we're evaluating without actually seeing the whole notebook. And so this tab is sometimes useful for that need, just seeing whatever data visualization we want to see at a given moment. And yeah, maybe it is a good time for comments, and then we have 15 more minutes to the official time, and we'll discuss some challenges and future hopes. Does anybody wish to say anything or ask anything? Yeah, yeah, let us maybe think for a moment if you may have some comments or thoughts about your hopes from tools like that about what you may find confusing or missing in this tool, or whatever comments you may have. Yeah, so I guess let us talk about some of the challenges here. So about user ergonomics, maybe let us jump to this demo again and let us see what is happening here. So many things can change throughout a user session, and one of them is changing the code, and another is evaluating some parts of the code. And then let us see. For example, I evaluate this, and I got I already got the result, and I evaluate this run, and I got the result. And now maybe I enter something in the middle, and I say another computation, and I save the file. And you see now Nodespace decided to remove the result of this random number it computed earlier. And that is not obvious because maybe it was still correct. Maybe we should keep it. And actually, in some situations, it is difficult for the tool to know that this piece of code is the same piece of code it had earlier, because we just inserted something in the middle. There was a code change. So we're using some diff algorithm using this library called edit script to reason about changes. And and this library called edit script is quite brilliant in the ideas it has about how to represent changes in a data structure. And I think we are still not using it in a very clever way. And it does bring up some situations where we could know more about what the user may expect to see in the notebook. And I think there are two gaps here. One gap is about what we can know. And, we are running into this gap. For example, before I just save the file now, what does my tool know? Does it know about the code I'm changing, right? At the moment. So at the moment, Nodespace doesn't know about the code I'm changing, but my editor does. So there is a gap here. Is this gap acceptable for the user who is just seeking some simple experience, right? So that is one thing. And another is how we represent it. What is known, what is known and unknown. And representing what is unknown is also important for the tool. And we are thinking about it, and we have had a few really interesting discussions about what we hope from our tools in these situations where there is a gap of knowledge. And so I hope to discuss more of these things, and maybe in another session we can be more thoughtful about these gaps and what we hope about them. And that is a very active topic, I think, not only in this tool. Oh, thank you, Vladimir, thank you for your comment. It was so wonderful to hear your comments during the session. So that is one kind of challenge. And another one is stability. Yeah, I did mention there are bugs. It was actually quite difficult to write this system for me. And it was, to me, a lesson about how to write a system that has some state and concurrency. And still, it turns out to be a challenge. Even though I'm trying to do much less than the other tools, it does run into very problematic situations, and it is still in that state. Another challenge is compatibility. So we saw some choices we had here, or how we represent kinds, right? So that was one of them, right? Yeah, maybe let's write it here. Kinds was one thing where we had a certain opinion of how we represent it. Another thing, kinds of visualization, right? Another thing is representing a visual output, right? Representing, for example, those hiccup-like structures are one way to represent visual outputs. Other tools have very similar ways, but just a little bit different. And another thing is like managing resources. For example, you may create some temporary files in your process and you want them to be part of your resulting document, like an image file, for example, or a data file. How can you contain all that context in a reproducible way in your resulting document without creating incompatibilities with other tools? How can different tools and libraries agree on such things? So that is maybe, in my opinion, one of the main challenges now for the ecosystem, where we saw there are quite a few tools which are evolving, and we should hope to create some dialogue between them. And what we can be happy about is that there are wonderful people behind those tools, and it is always so nice to talk with them. But still, it is a challenge because people wish to keep exploring and keep being very inventive about the way they're creating their tools. And compatibility might be an obstacle. Having to decide about standards might be blocking future inventions, right? So that is one of our usual challenges, especially in a Lisp community, of course, as we know. Yeah, and there is this question of where we hope to go now. So in the case of Nodespace, what I hope is to mostly stabilize it, solve some bugs, solve those ergonomics problems we were mentioning, and look into connecting to other tools. Nodespace might not be needed if the other tools grow to answer all our needs. But at the moment, I think we are all in this state of exploration where we still need something. We're still looking for this dynamic, playful exploration experience that we have in the Clojure REPL. And we are gradually bringing it to the visual documents. And since we are in this state, I think it is still important to keep exploring ideas. And I think that has been the role of Nodespace, a place where we can explore some of the ideas of dynamic, playful interaction. And probably Nodespace will use the front end of one of the other tools very soon, so that at least on that path, we will gain compatibility. And yeah, dialogue across users and developers is the main thing for the coming few weeks, I think, where these things are going. So that is where we are, and I hope we'll have some discussion now if there are any thoughts about this. And tomorrow there is a workshop about Oz, which is this magnificent tool, which is more established than Nodespace and very much useful in various situations. So I encourage you to go to Christopher Small's workshop about Oz. And yeah, and we will also probably organize some meetings to think about this topic and maybe build something together at the community. So if anybody is interested in learning more about these tools, helping in building them, helping in building bridges across tools, just trying them out and helping discover bugs, I'll be happy to talk with any of you if you wish to do that. Yeah, so that is the end of this part. And now we have some time to questions. I see there is a comment of ST in this chat. So I'm reading this comment. Yeah, actually, I'll read it now. So ST is writing. I think would be cool to have a small REPL integrated into Nodespace itself. I imagine you mean the browser view. So if you don't need, you could even do small modifications to the namespace itself without leaving the browser. For example, imagine that you already have a pretty well-developed namespace and you just want to call existing functions with different parameters or combine them together. So you don't need a fully fledged editor, just a REPL with autocomplete. Brilliant, yeah, brilliant ideas. And I think one of the places where very similar ideas to yours are explored is this project called Goldly that we mentioned. But Goldly is looking to create both things, and that is also, you know, both things, both kinds of experience. Being in your editor and REPL and interacting it in some kind of lightweight browser interaction. And that is one of the reasons that I hope to possibly use Goldly as a frontend for Nodespace, or in other words, Nodespace as a backend for Goldly. So thank you for this brilliant comment, ST, and yeah, I hope to see such things happening